Hello, hello. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are going to be talking about the right order of effects in mastering and also for your mix bus. And I actually think you can take some of the principles in today's episode and apply it to the right order for processing or effects on just about anything and just about anywhere. But we're going to look at this through the lens of mastering. I've been getting some emails in and comments and asking me to reveal my complete mastering chain. And my mastering chain actually changes from session to session, but I do have the Pro Tools screen open here, and I'm going to make one of my mastering chains for you right here in real time and give you a sense for what I'm thinking about, what kind of order of operations I'm looking for, what effects are always in my mastering chain, and in which order they go. And there's a couple of funny little things here. Number one, I will tell you right off the bat that I always put in the last effect in my mastering chain first. So the very last processor that's there goes on first. And the very first processor I use usually goes on last. Does that sound like a riddle? Well, it's not. It's actually quite simple. And I'll get into why that is. So the order that the effects go on in the chain isn't the order that I actually put them into the chain. And we'll talk about why that is. Before I get into it, I just have to give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. The most important sponsor on this podcast is always being you. How do you sponsor this podcast? By checking out one of our great full-length courses. Sponsor this podcast by sponsoring yourself. You can check out Mixing Breakthroughs, and it'll give you a whole bunch of insights into the mixing process. It will change the way that you work forever, for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. Or you can check out Mastering Demystified. That's probably the most appropriate one for today's topic if you're really into mastering and you want to learn how to master for yourself on your own tracks or to make more money by mastering for others. Definitely check out Mastering Demystified. That's an absolutely great one. Go to masteringdemystified.com or type into the Google machine. I hope it should be the first result. It almost certainly is. So, check it out. Check those out. Also, you can sponsor this podcast by becoming a member here right on YouTube. There's a join button you'll see on anywhere except for an iOS device. For $5 a month, you get access right now to our mixed feedback sessions and our Q&A sessions. And I actually have some big changes coming up to the membership thing going forward starting next month, which members will find out about first. So there's some cool stuff going on there. Also, really quick shout out and thanks before we get into the rest of this episode to Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. All right back into it. The order of operations for mastering. Well, in every single session that I do, the very first thing I do is actually this. I adjust gain staging. And not just gain staging, but also my playback level. And this is one of the very first things that my mastering mentor, Joe Lambert, taught to me when I started to learn mastering at his studio on a beautiful old school fancy hybrid analog digital mastering setup where we had, one computer instead of 80 to D converters going out into an all analog mastering rig and then back into another set of actually A to D converters on this side and into a second computer where we could do additional processing. But before going into that rig and before making any choices, one of the big things was, hey man, let's get this up to an appropriate listening level. Because Joe was big on the idea of you should be listening to, if you're doing mastering, listening to all of your masters at roughly the same level. So he had a little SPL meter right there on the top of his desk. And he would measure out something like, I forget if he listened at 80 or 81 dB, which is around where we have the flattest hearing perception. And he could develop this physical sense for just how things were hitting him in the studio. And I took the same approach as him. I monitored a little bit louder. I'm more of like an 83 dB guy. Sometimes I'll go even slightly louder than that. But especially if you're listening on speakers, there's a way that it hits your body and there's a way in which your hearing flattens out and you can kind of develop a sense for how that room sounds on those speakers at that level. And if you're in mastering, it's really important to get those things consistent. You can be a little bit more loosey-goosey with it when it comes to mixing, and I think listening at a variety of levels throughout mixing is a good idea, at least 2 different levels that you go to, a quieter level and a louder level. But I'm not really telling you something about the chain other than when things hit the desk, you'd crank up the input a little bit until you're at roughly an appropriate listening level. Now, sometimes that is difficult to do appropriately unless you're starting to add the very first thing that I put in my chain always, which is a limiter. Man, look at this giant list of plugins here. For those of you who are on the video version of this podcast, you'll see I have entirely too many plugins here. So we'll do a quick search, and I'll tell you about my favorite limiters that I put on. Before I go even further into this, I guess I should say, for people who are wondering, what are my qualifications? Well, I'm a mastering engineer with platinum credits and gold credits too. But I guess every record that goes platinum goes gold, so you kind of have gold credits if you have platinum credits by default. But yeah, so I've been mastering, I've been working in audio professionally for a couple of decades, and I'm trying to sing my praises more on the podcast, because every once in a while I get a comment and like, who's this guy I think he is? You shouldn't listen to just any YouTuber. And it's like, well, I'm not just any YouTuber. You could like look me up. Why don't you look up the people you're listening to? That's generally a good idea. If you're taking someone's advice on something, see what they're about. And if you want to see what I'm about, you can find out who I am. But for those of you who are new, yeah, I've been doing audio professionally for a couple of decades, mastering for, man, it's been 10 or 15 years that I've been focusing on mastering. And yeah, so I'm not terrible at it. At the very least, the mastering results I get don't stop records from being heard by hundreds of millions of people. So most of that is the musician's fault rather than mine. See, I'm not even good at singing my praises. All right, let's continue on. Okay, so the very first thing that I put on is going to be a limiter. And I'll usually, of course, go in and use the search function here. My favorite limiters for mastering, and we'll talk in a little bit as well about mix bus and how these concepts apply to mixing anything. But for right now, I'm going to focus on mastering because that's what I'm leading with. My favorite limiters to use, I probably have 3 limiters that I use on most of the masters I do. They are, 1, the BX limiter True Peak. This one I really like, and it's a kind of smooth, thick sounding limiter to me. Like it has this, yeah, kind of smooth and full-bodied feel. And I use this one a lot. But it's not the only limiter I use. One of the other most common limiters that I'll pull up, by the way, it's not sponsored by these guys or the next guys I'm about to pull up, FabFilter, their Pro L2. To me, this is a slightly tighter sounding limiter and slightly brighter and more aggressive in a way. If you want a really bright, tight sounding limiter, I barely ever use this, but every once in a while I will. The original Maxim limiter that comes with Pro Tools has this really almost edgy sound to it. And every once in a while I'll pull it out when I'm looking for more of that vibe. But another one of the limiters I use a lot is the Ozone Maximizer from Isotope. And this one can sound a variety of different ways. Here, I'll pull open the Ozone 10 Maximizer, only because Ozone 11, as much as I love Isotope, it's still a little crashy and buggy on my machine. But I still love Isotope regardless. There's a few different limiter modes in here, and each one sounds different. And before I get into that, I don't want to bore you with me nerding out as a mastering engineer about limiters, although if that's what you want, let me know in the chat if you're here for the live premiere of this. If you want me to nerd out on limiters, tell me how much gory detail you want me to go into. But it has a few different modes. But one of the reasons I put the limiter here first is that, 1, it helps me get things to an appropriate level. That's number 1. And number 2, it gives me clear insights into what needs to be done to the master. Because most mixes that come in a little quieter than they want to finally end up in mastering. And I'm going to be adding at least a little bit of additional level to most, although not all, records that come into the studio for mastering. And as soon as you start applying mastering, 2 things happen. 1, mastering is sometimes like a little bit of a cheat and a panacea, where just putting a limiter on things in mastering will make it sound better and more like a finished record. Like sometimes you take something like, oh, I want to do all these things in mastering. I feel like I need to change the EQ here and bring this instrument out a little bit more and kind of tuck these in the sides. And then you put a limiter on it and it starts doing 2 dB of limiting. And you're like, oh, that just sounds more like a finished record. Is it cheating if I just put on a limiter, send it back, and then charge them? And no, it's not cheating. That's sometimes what you should be doing. But also limiting can do the opposite. It can easily make things that have problems sound way worse. And sometimes you'll start to put limiting on a track and it'll just sound really kind of cluttered and muddy and veiled. And the mix will sound like a louder but worse version of itself. And that happens very often, particularly on masters that need to get a little brighter. Which will lead us into the next processor I usually put on, which is my EQ. We'll get into that in just a second. So before I go on into the EQ, last thing I want to say about the limiter is when I'm selecting my limiter, I'm selecting it based on what kind of sound I want. And I already mentioned that the BX limiter True Peak and the Fab Filter Pro L2 limiter, they have slightly different sounds, with one of them being a little tighter and one of them being a little fatter and smoother to my ear. And this is due to, a lot of it at least is due to the particular attack and release characteristics of that limiter. And if you want to know how and why a particular dynamic range processor might sound tighter and one might sound faster, you can check out the full-length course, Compression Breakthroughs. You go through the first 90 minutes on that course. The whole course is like 8 or 9 hours if you actually get through the whole thing. But if you go through the first 90 minutes, there's a whole bunch of listening exercises that will really teach you to hear and use compression better than you ever have before. And I already have a question coming in. Das Lucky asks, hold up, the first plugin in the chain is a limiter? No. This is what I said in the beginning, Das Lucky, is that it's not the first plugin in the chain. It is the last plugin in the chain, but I put it on first. Does that make sense? This is what I led with. It is the last processor in the entire chain, but I put it on first. And I'm giving you now the reasons that I put it on first. So if I have a track that wants to get a little fatter, like it's a little bit too light on its feet and a little tic-tacky sounding, I might use a limiter that sounds a little fatter and smoother to me. If, on the other hand, I have a track that sounds a little bit too beefy and it needs a little bit more detail and a little bit more snap or edge or aggression out of it, I might use a slightly brighter, tighter sounding limiter. And those are two of the ones for me that I often pull up. But very often I'll pull up the Ozone Maximizer, and it has a couple of different options here. I really like the IRC1 for if I'm doing very little limiting. Like if there's just 1 dB and less of limiting happening, the IRC1 I find can be really transparent. But if you're doing aggressive limiting, 3 and 4 dB of limiting, more in some genres, then the IRC1 just doesn't hold up and it can sound a little cloudy, like it's too fat sounding. Another limiter mode I'll often use in this one is the IRC2, the second limiter mode that they came out with. And they describe this one as being, let's see if we hover over it, it says, Intelligent Release Control 2, clear and sharp limiting to preserve peaks. And I think that's a great way of characterizing it. I consider this to be a tight sounding limiter. Clear and sharp is another great way of construing this IRC2 mode. And if I have a track that's really beefy and wants to go in the direction of being a little brighter and a little lighter on its feet, I'll often use this, the IRC2, or maybe I'll use the Fab Filter in certain settings, and maybe I'll use the Maxim if it needs to be really kind of sharp and tight. And then probably the other really common one I use is this here, the IRC4 mode. And there's like 3 different modes, classic, modern, and transient. I use the modern one a lot. This one is very smooth sounding, and I find that in genres that need a lot of limiting, you can really dig in without hearing the limiter too much, and it makes things just a little bit more smooth without being overly harsh, overly aggressive, or overly muddy. So it's a really nice balanced one. So this is me nerding out about limiter choice, and this is the first thing I do is I get the record up to an appropriate level. Part of that is gain staging, turning up the input if necessary. If it's super quiet, like this track came in, I'm probably going to turn this one up by about 6 or 7 dB before it even hits my mastering chain. Or every once in a while, I'll need to turn it down by a dB or 2 if it's already kind of brick-walled and limited, and I'm probably doing less loudening to that. I might need to lower it so it's not hitting my whole mastering chain too hard. So the first processing I do is about level. And it's me kind of selecting things, getting my first impressions. Which direction does this record need to go, and what limiter is most going to complement that? Now, if you start doing listening tests on limiters, if you're doing them sighted, you will probably hear a lot of things that maybe you can't hear in a blind test. And if you do things blind, you might be like, oh, some of these differences start to disappear, but some of them are still there. And as you develop your ear more, you'll probably be able to hear more and more things blind. But there's also a limit to the differences you can hear totally blind. And every once in a while, the stories we tell ourselves are more powerful than the changes in sound themselves. And this is one area where you have to be careful of not obsessing about it too much, because this is an area where the differences between limiter modes are something that I can pick out in blind tests and have, but I have to admit are very subtle, and they're not the most important thing I do in limiting. But they're still the thing I want to do first. I'm establishing the right level we're trying to get to. And here's the thing. If a record should be hitting at -8 LUFS, because like all of the artists' favorite records are hitting about -8 on the meters. That's a fairly hot master, but not crazy hot. And that's where all of their favorite records are sitting. And when I bring it up to -8 with doing some gauge staging and doing some limiting, and I get it there and the whole thing falls apart, that is already telling me something. It is telling me I need to dig in here with the next processor. The processor that is one of the first on my chain that I put in second. And that is an EQ. And there are so many different EQs you can use in mastering. The one that I really learned on was the Maselec MEA2 EQ. And just recently, this one was recreated by Relab. And I have been using this in my mastering chain regularly. I brought it back into my mastering chain as soon as this thing came out. I think it was like the spring of 2024. And it's just a really clean analog EQ that is just voiced really well. And I use this one a lot. The other big EQ that I'll often use, and will often come before this one in the chain, is another favorite of mine, the Sontec EQ. And this, again, is one of the ones that I learned on. This is a recreation made by Make Believe Studios. And this is a slightly more colorful one. And there's just something about the low shelf on this Sontec EQ that is just gorgeous. And you've heard it on so many records. And this one has a bit more of its own tone. Like you get a little bit of saturation out of this one potentially when you're feeding it a pretty hot signal. And these are two of my favorite EQs to use because I learned how to EQ on them. With that said, I went through a period from 2016 to 2014 where I didn't use these EQs, and I was doing almost all of my EQing between two different EQs. Once again, the Isotope Ozone EQ. And I have done countless masters just using Isotope's Ozone EQ, which is a really good, really simple one. And another one that is very similar to this, the FabFilter EQ. Yes, I have mastered relatively significantly released records with the FabFilter Pro Q3 and the Ozone EQ, and I'm not alone in doing that. The only problem with some of these is that they can be a little bit too visual sometimes, and I sometimes like the analog style EQs. They restrict you a tiny bit more. They have a tiny bit more of a kind of curated tone of their own, and there's some benefits, I think, to the less visual process when it comes to mastering. That said, I've mastered a countless number of records using nothing but the Ozone or nothing but the FabFilter. They each kind of take me in different directions. They should theoretically sound the same if they're doing the same stuff, but I found that I tilt more towards one direction or another with one or the other, but it really just ultimately is the same kind of stuff with a different GUI. The Pro Q3 has even more features in it, some really cool features. The Ozone has a lot of features in it too. They're just a little bit different. Sometimes for me, I feel like the Ozone is a little bit simpler and encourages me to over EQ less, where the Pro Q3, since it can do so much and you can practically have an unlimited number of bands, sometimes it leads me towards getting a little bit too EQ happy. So I often start with the Ozone 10 EQ or the Ozone 11 EQ because it's just a little bit more limited than the FabFilter. And one of the big things in mastering is hopefully you're not doing too much to the signal. So, first thing I do, bring up the level, put on a limiter, find the right limiter mode. Then I start EQing. And if you want to know about how I EQ and what I'm looking to do with EQ, you can check out a whole video I did recently about the 4 basic EQ shapes. And I demonstrated that using the Maselec MEA2 EQ. And in that video, I basically go over the fact that there are only really 4 things you can do to EQ. There are 4 directions. There are 4 cardinal directions of EQ. You're either, in short, making things brighter, making things darker, making things more scooped, or making things more mid-rangey. Those are the 4 cardinal directions of EQ. And I talk about how to discover which of those is the appropriate way to go. And I do a ton of audio examples in that video. So check that one out. Maybe I'll remember to put it in the show notes or put it on screen, or you can just type in 4 ways to EQ Colletti or SonicScoop or something. I'm sure you'll find it. That one is super useful and it's scripted and edited. So it will waste even less of your time in this video, which I hope is not a waste of time at all, but instead is incredibly insightful. All right, continuing onwards. The Maselec EQ and the Sontec EQ, those are often the second things I'm putting into my chain these days. And then if I need to do more than that, I might throw on a EQ like the isotope or the fab filter to do one or two additional things if I really have to. But hopefully in most masters, I'm not using all of the bands. Maybe I'm using one or two bands off of the Maselec, one or two bands off of the Sontec. I do that because I learned how to master using these, and it's a more fun and less visual process for me and a little bit more of an intuitive process. But you don't have to do that. You can just pull up one all-purpose EQ, and for most people, that's going to be perfectly fine in mastering. And the ozone and the fab filter are great, and I'm sure there are a ton of others that are great as well. What's the next thing that I do after this? Well, the next big thing I look at is compression. And this is kind of a little bit like my approach to limiting, where I'm trying to pick out a compressor that I think is going to do the general kind of thing I want done in this track. It might be that I want some type of SSL style bus compressor. So we might search for an SSL. Ooh, one of my favorite SSL bus compressors, if I really want a really characterful one, is the Townhouse here from Brainworks and Plug-in Alliance. So every once in a while, you'll get a master that just doesn't have enough compression on the mix bus, and like part of the sound of the genre is having a little bit of that SSL style compression, maybe with a relatively fast attack. Maybe it's a 3 millisecond attack thing. Maybe it's a 1 millisecond. Maybe it's a 10 millisecond. And then the release. For me on this, it's usually, are we doing the auto release vibe of an SSL, which is kind of smooth, or are we trying to make this thing a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more modern and go for a really fast release? If you want to know the difference in sound between a slow release and a fast attack and a slow attack, I have so many videos on that, and you should check them out. Or you can get it all into your brain at once with a ton of audio examples with the course Compression Breakthroughs, which will teach you to compress and to hear compression like no other. So this might be the thing that I put on. If I say, it wants a little bit more dynamic range control, they kind of underdid compression on the mix, I'm going to add a little bit more in mastering. And maybe it's that SSL kind of vibe because it's a rock track or a certain kind of pop track that just wants a little bit of that SSL style glue, or every once in a while SSL style punch. The difference there being the attack and release times. Or I might say, ooh, this sounds good, but I just want something else in the chain to just tap down, maybe just ever so slightly, but I'm using it almost more like a tone box, like a color box in a compressor. And some of my favorites there, again, often some of this Plug-in Alliance stuff. I worked with those guys helping them make videos for a long time because I love their stuff. And one of those I'll often use is the Shadow Hills mastering compressor. And they have two different versions of this, the original one that has like green lights on it and the Class A mastering one. And they each have a tone. I actually often like to use the non-mastering one, the one with the green lights, because it just has this, it makes things a little bit more mid-rangey and a little bit more focused. And every once in a while, I'm working on a record and I'm like, they made this thing sound big and open and pretty, but their favorite records just sound a little bit more organic and a little bit more almost mangy than their mix sounds. And we want to just make it sound a little bit more earthy. And for that, I really like the Shadow Hills, the original mastering compressor. And it might be doing very little, if any, compression with it, but part of it is a tonal thing. Another one that I might pull open is this SPL compressor, the SPL Iron. And again, this is a compressor to me that has a little bit of a specific sound. This one I find to be ever so slightly brighter than the original analog hardware version of it. It just has a little bit less bass bloom, but it sounds really close to the original analog hardware. But this one gives an ever so slightly, in its basic default settings at least, a little bit of a tiny kind of scoopy smiley face thing in the character of the sound. And that's not to say it's really changing the frequency response that much, but just the things that it highlights, some of the, like where we're getting harmonic distortion out of the unit, just what frequencies the compressor reacts a little bit more to or a little bit less to. And for me, each of those has its own vibe. The SSL compressor, the Shadow Hills, particularly the non-mastering version, when I want things to sound just a little bit more focused and mid-range and organic, and when I want things to have a little bit more of a sheen to them, this SPL Iron. And those three are three compressors that I pull up a lot. They're not the only three, but that's something that I'm often pulling up if I want one of two things. A little bit of additional tonal color, or B, a little bit of additional compression, like the original track was a bit undercompressed. But those aren't the only types of compressors I use. There are certain tracks where I might pull up, again, the ozone compressor or the fab filter compressor. And again, not sponsored video. I'm just showing you how I actually work. So Ozone 10 Dynamics. Here, I'll grab this one. One of the things I like about this compressor is you can switch back and forth between multiband and single band, which is cool. I often just use it in single band. And then it has two compressors in one. And there are these situations where I want to do two types of compression. This is not uncommon in mastering, particularly on masters for clients who are afraid to do as much in the mix as they should. And I feel like I have to dig in a little bit harder to do that kind of thing that takes it more in the direction of a final master in their style, where some of the best mixers who they're referencing are just a little bit more heavy-handed in the mix than they are. And I have to bring a little bit of that vibe in and do a little bit more dynamic control on the record. So I love that it allows me to have two compressors in one. So it has this compressor where I might set a low ratio, 1.8 to 1 or something. And I might set it with a relatively slow attack time. And then I might use this limiter as just a really fast compressor. So I might set it to a 3 to 1 ratio with a really fast attack time here at half a millisecond and a really fast release time. And the idea here is that one compressor is just ever so slightly compressing mostly peaks. It's a super fast compressor with a relatively high ratio to control the peaks. And the other compressor might have a slower attack to bring those transients forward. So why would I have one compressor controlling peaks and then one compressor bringing peaks out? This is the idea of serial compression, and I have free videos on this, or if you want a whole lot of detail into this approach, how to do it, why to do it, and a whole lot of audio examples, check out the full-length course, Compression Breakthroughs, or a whole lot of the ideas there are also in Mastering Demystified. But the general idea here is I might want to use two compressors every once in a while because the record needs more dynamic control. Like there's just too much erratic stuff happening in the transients. But then once you actually bring some smoothness into the record and you control the transients so it's not all over the place and doesn't feel sloppy and unfocused and overly punchy in a bad way anymore, and you made the band feel like more dynamically consistent, once you do that, you can get rid of a lot of the transient that gives punch and impact and personality and life to the record. So too much fast attack compression can smooth things out in a good way, but it can smooth things out too much and take away punch and life. Adding in after that a slower attack compressor can take those now controlled transients and exaggerate them and bring them back. So you can almost uncompress to a degree, take some of the slightly reduced transients and have them start leaping out at you more. So that's the general idea. If I want two compressors on a mix, I might do it with something like this, the Ozone compressor, which has two compressors in one. And it's a reason I'll pull it out often. I'm looking for less of a character compressor and more for dynamic range control. Now, after I've got my limiter on, an EQ on, and a compressor on if necessary, what else? Well, every once in a while, a record is going to need a little bit more saturation. So I might pull up some type of tape simulator. There are so many different good ones. The Studer A800 is one that I've used a whole bunch. Oops, I don't have my UAD interface on at the moment, so this DSP-powered version of it is disabled. But I think you get the idea. This is the Studer tape machine. This is one that I like a lot. The Ampex one is really nice. There's a really nice one in the Plug-in Alliance bundle from Kive Audio called the Tape Face. This one is a little bit more heavy-handed, but sometimes I need a lot of tape tone, and the Tape Face is really nice for that. That one actually is taking a second to load. Here it is. This one can be a real character compressor. And sometimes I will use the Ozone tape simulator, but there's so many different good ones from so many different brands. Here, I'll pull up the Ozone one. This one, every once in a while, I'll use these high and low emphasis, but often I'm selecting one of these tape speeds. 30 inches per second on a real tape machine that's really well maintained can sound almost indistinguishable from the original source. Like it's so close to digital, it's almost like why bother having a tape machine? But a lot of these emulations in their 30 inches per second mode, really fast hi-fi tape, will sound just a slight hair different from the original in a way that could potentially work. This is generally the brightest setting on most of these tape emulators. A 15 inches per second mode, I might do this on some of those rock records where on the mix, there's too much low end in the mix, and 15 inches per second on a tape machine will get rid of some of the extreme low frequencies and then might have a little bit of a head bump further up in the bass. And then it has this nice softening effect in the upper mid-range and the high frequencies that can take some harshness out of electric guitars and kind of smooth out cymbals. So sometimes this is a good one for rock, depending on the style of rock. And then one that I often use, which is theoretically too heavy-handed for mastering, but sometimes all digitally produced records need a little bit of extra glue. And it is not uncommon at all for me to use the 7.5 inches per second setting on some of these tape simulators, particularly the Ozone tape simulator. This one in the Ozone tape emulator makes things sound so dark compared to the original, but sometimes it's exactly what is needed. Like it adds just a little bit of saturation. You can boost up more saturation with this harmonics knob, and then it just darkens and softens the top end in a way that sometimes gets the record way closer to how these people's favorite records actually sound. Now, if I'm using a mode like this, sometimes it makes things so dark that I might have to brighten stuff up afterwards. Now, when I say so dark, I'm exaggerating. It's not like you're taking a 3 dB shelf and turning down 3 dB of high end with your EQ. It's not like crazy dark, but it really does fatten things out and smooth things out and thicken things out almost too much, to the point where I have to go back and do a little bit of extra carving out in the low mids or a little bit less bass boosting than I would otherwise. But I will do that on some of these machines, particularly this one, the Ozone. And I also like it on the Kive Audio. Sometimes they're 7.5 inches per second setting, but then I'll just mix in a little bit of it. And I wish that on the Ozone 10, they had a mix knob for this, because sometimes I'd love to use their 7.5 setting, but not have it be all the way there. Maybe they've updated that on the latest versions of Ozone. I'd have to look into that. Or there are some fancy ways of creating a mix knob for yourself by using aux ends, which I have done. But honestly, what I've often done is if I want that 7.5 inches per second kind of tone, and I want to be able to mix it in, I'll just grab the Kive Audio tape face, which does that. So that is what I'm looking at next. So my basically tape and or saturation. And it might not be tape saturation that I use in everything. Sometimes I might use tape saturation plus some other general saturator, or I might just use a general saturator. And there's a lot of ones to use. But once again, I got to tell you, I use at least like 2 Ozone modules, if not more, on practically every master I do. Another one of the ones from them that I like a lot is their exciter. And this is a cool saturator because you have several different modes, and each of these modes sounds different. There's a lot of different types of saturation. They have analog, retro, tape, tube, warm, triode, dual triode. For example here, their triode setting is a relatively bright, almost buzzy sounding type of saturation. And sometimes I might take my low frequencies and just add the tiniest bit of saturation to the low frequencies. You know, I might turn the amount up just a little bit and just a tiny bit of mix. But then where I'm really saturating is going to be the mid-range and higher frequencies. And I might set those to more of a tape style saturation, which is going to be a lot fatter and smoother and kind of taking off the edges a little bit of things. And I might do everything above a certain point, tape saturation, and everything below a certain point, maybe a tiny bit of triode saturation, or maybe nothing at all in the low frequencies. Or every once in a while, you know what, I'll want an additional band, and in the high frequencies, this is one where we're going to put in even more tape saturation, but just in the high frequencies. So you could have a curve that looks something like this, where maybe there's a tiny hint of a relatively bright sounding saturation in the lows, if any. Maybe there's a little bit more of a thicker sounding saturation in the mids, and then maybe there's even more thick sounding saturation in the top. It could be the exact opposite in some other record. In some other record, you might turn off the saturation in the high frequencies completely because you want this more kind of bright, sparkly, twinkly aesthetic in the top end. So these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. Some of these changes are pretty subtle. Every once in a while, some of them can be significant, but the most significant changes are often going to be EQ. Usually the ideal in mastering is that most of my moves are going to be half dB and dB changes, but there are some of those records where you got to do 2.5, 3 dB changes in mastering somewhere in there to really get it to feel like a record in this style should. Some records need a lot more help and some need very little help. And you have to know when not to touch anything and not to try to impress the client by showing them how much more impressive or how much more different it could sound after mastering. There's a lot of records where I barely want to touch a thing. And then there's other records where I know they want me to help them. They want me to amp things up more. They want me to do the things in mastering that they were afraid to do in mixing. And sometimes I do those for clients and they're just like shocked by how far things can come in mastering. And either of those approaches can be appropriate depending on the needs, goals, and confidence of the mixer who's submitting material to you. What I have found though is for those clients where I do like tremendous amount of mastering, like it really reshapes things and it goes from like okay to wow after mastering, usually they'll ask me exactly what I did. I'll tell them. And the next time I master something from them, they've learned so much from that process and that feedback. They get so much better at at mixing, that the next time I master for them, I barely need to do anything at all, or I do half as much because they've realized, hey, I could be doing that stuff in mixing. And if I do, I'll have even better results. All right. So we've talked about the first thing I put on is the last thing in the chain, my limiter. The second thing I put on is one of the first things in my chain, the EQ. And the third thing that I put on is usually compression dynamic range control if I need that. And then the fourth thing I put on is my saturation. Because hopefully I don't have to add a whole bunch of additional saturation to the record. There's enough in there. Once I've done this stuff, then I get to the place where I'm like, okay, does it need a little bit more harmonic distortion? That's where I'm thinking about things like saturation. And I might think about clippers as part of this as well. The clippers we use in mastering are called hard clippers and soft clippers. A soft clipper is kind of a saturator, and a lot of things labeled as hard clippers are also kind of saturators. When I say clipping, I'm usually meaning the kind of analog sense of clipping where things are really just really hard saturators that you might fold in a tiny bit of. So all of those kinds of things go together. And why is this? Well, it's because when I put on a limiter, it's going to reveal to me things that need to happen to the EQ. When I get things up to an appropriate level, I'm hearing things better because of the curve of my ears, like how I hear things. You have a flatter frequency response in your ears, the Fletcher-Munson curve, once you're listening to things at an appropriate SPL level in your room or on your headphones. And also because when you're referencing against other records, you kind of want to level match things to a degree. And part of what's happening, though, in the sound of a lot of records is limiting. And not everyone hears things level matched all the time. Part of mastering is making things slightly louder. And if you can make it sound just as good, but louder, most people are going to want that. Because even though there is automatic volume normalization out there in the wild these days, it does an imperfect job. And it will take the loudest tracks and turn them down, but it does that imperfectly. So most records to this day are still mastered hotter than the streaming services recommend. And if you're listening to a whole bunch of reference records, like all the artist's favorite records are -10 LUFS or around there, or all their favorite records are -5, really hot records, those are the references. And part of the sound of those references is the amount of limiting being applied. And if you put on enough limiting to get up to that level and everything falls apart, it means that a lot has to happen with EQ to reduce the intensity, usually of low frequencies and low mids. A lot of limiting, excessive limiting, can make things sound really muddy, really clouded, and it can overemphasize the mid-range. It can make things sound boxier. You're taking away definition that was coming from the punch and the transients. So you're going to have to put some definition back into the record, often by carving out low mids and sometimes low frequencies. Very often, both. Okay, moving onwards. Why does compression come after that? Well, I really think that you should be able to do, in an ideal world, almost all of your mastering with just a limiter and an EQ. And like those are your two most important tools. The limiter brings things up to appropriate loudness. Pick one that takes the record in the general direction you want to go anyway. If it wants to go brighter, brighter limiter. If it wants to go fatter, fatter sounding limiter. Then you do some EQ. And then after that, okay, in an ideal world, I've done a half dB and 1 dB changes on my EQ, and I've done half dB and 1 dB addition and limiting, and that's the end. And we have such a perfect mix, that's all I need to do. That happens on some mixes from the best mixers, but not all. The next thing after that is, okay, do we need to add more character and personality to this record? And do we need to add more dynamic control to it? And I'm kind of asking both those questions at once. Dynamic control, I'm probably going to want to use a compressor to do some additional dynamic control or dynamic reshaping. bringing out more transient, smoothing out transient. So the compressor goes in. Then after the compressor or compressors, sometimes there's two, I'm thinking about saturation. Why saturation after? Well, because if you take your saturator and put it on before your compressor, and you're going to be evening things out, in general, if you are compressing first into a saturator, you'll have a much more even response out of that saturator, right? Because if you have erratic dynamics going into a saturator, the hotter the signal hits the saturator, the more it saturates. The less hot you hit the saturator, the less it saturates. Most, although not all, saturators are somewhat level dependent. Hotter signals make them saturate more. So if you don't want your saturator to sound somewhat erratic, or you're getting more saturation on louder parts and you're getting less saturation on quieter parts, but you're going to smooth out the difference between loud and quiet, you should smooth out the difference between loud and quiet before you hit your saturator, so you get a more consistent sound out of your saturator. And that's a big principle that you can take to effects on anything, any instrument, and on your mix bus as well. Okay, after that, I might throw on a spatializer, something that's going to give me stereo width. And this is one more shameless plug for not sponsored, although these guys should sponsor the channel. They used to sponsor a bunch back in the day, and they should get back on sponsoring it, is Ozone. The Ozone spatializer called the Ozone Imager. And one of the reasons I like the Ozone Imager is because it is a multiband imager. Often I'm taking higher frequencies and adding a little bit of width to them. So maybe everything above 100 hertz, 150 hertz, 200 hertz, somewhere around here, taking those frequencies and spreading them a bit more. And sometimes, depending on the style of mastering we're going for, you might be reducing the width in the low end. And that was really common advice back in the day, is that you should always try to have less width in the low end or center your lows. And there's a lot of records that have been made that way, where literally it's mono below a certain point, and then stereo above that point, and maybe you're even widening it after that. That said, on modern record production, like records in the past 5-10 years, we've been hearing wider and wider low frequencies. And there are some records where I will actually increase the amount of stereo width in the low frequencies, even in the sub bass. Sometimes I will do that. Not always. There's still certain records, certain aesthetics, more of like a classic-y rock aesthetic, you might want to center the lows. But if it's more of like this kind of modern demented rock aesthetic or a lot of pop aesthetics, you might want to widen out the low frequency slightly. And then sometimes I might not widen the high frequencies as much as the mids. Like every once in a while, it's like, ooh, this record needs to feel wider and fatter, like in the mids. So it's going to be from like 200 hertz to 1K. It'll be like way wider. And then maybe just a tiny bit wider in the high end and not at all wider in the lows. Something like that could happen. Another thing that I like to use for stereo widening, I won't always pull out this widener, is it can be part of the compression process, because I often use these plugins, and almost all of them have a mono maker where you can center the low frequencies, and a stereo width control, which will expand the width above that point. And this thing sounds really good, especially when you want that more classical approach of an elliptical filter that were built into mastering consoles in the analog domain for ages. So many of the records that I worked on, like almost as a matter of course, would use a mono maker like filter below 30 hertz, below 40 hertz, maybe even higher than that. And if I want to add a lot of width to the record, maybe the mono maker would go even higher. And I still do this trick sometimes, but not always. So that's another place I might get stereo width. And to me, it just makes sense to put my processed audio through the widener rather than the other way around. I've tried it both ways, and it just also intuitively makes sense to me that I want to take my basically processed chain, and one of the last things that I'm doing is putting on the widener after all that processing has happened. You could play around with it. Like I've also tried putting the saturator after the widener. Usually I do widener after saturator. I've tried both ways. Usually for me, the widener is one of the, last things before the limiter. And that has made sense to me, but I don't think there needs to be a fixed order with that. I don't think it's that important. And then the last thing that I'm likely to put on in mastering is the first thing in my chain. And the first thing in my chain, this is where I might be looking at a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor. There's so many good options. Here's an analog style multiband compressor, the MLA4 from Relab Maselec. I should do a whole video on this one eventually. Maybe I'll collaborate with those guys, and I will. Really love this stuff. The MLA4, really cool sounding compressor from Maselec. It is a 3-band multiband compressor. Some of the other ones that I've been known to use, there's a API one from, if you want a really kind of tight sounding multiband compressor, the Lindell MBC from Plug-in Alliance. That's a really nice one. Also, the Fab filter. It's the MB Pro. This is a great one. The MB Pro, if you want a really flexible multiband compressor, you can put in multiple bands right here. I really like the layout of this one. I'll often use this one for multiband compressor, and I'll often use Ozone has a good one. If you just get the regular Ozone compressor we were looking at earlier, you can turn this one into a multiband compressor by adding additional bands. And I'll often do this first in the chain, but less and less I'm doing it as a multiband compressor. And more, instead of multiband compression at the beginning of my chain, I might use a dynamic EQ. There's a bunch of great ones. FabFilter's Pro Q2 has a dynamic EQ built into it. Ozone, again, has a great dynamic EQ. Let me pull up one here on the screen. Here's the Ozone 10 dynamic EQ again. You could use this in FabFilter. There's a great one from Plug-in Alliance, or Kirchhoff. So many good options. But the reason I'll put these first in the chain is especially for controlling low end. Sometimes you want to cut some low end out of the record, but not all the low end. And when you find that you're taking down everything below 100 hertz, you're tightening up the kick drum, but then all of a sudden you lose the bass. So what I might do is take a shelving filter and be like, okay, I'm going to make a cut right here around 80 hertz, 60 hertz, wherever it is. We'll put in a cut here. But when our kick drum hits, we'll actually use it as an upward expander. So with this dynamic EQ, I'm cutting the low frequencies. But when our dominant primary kick instrument comes in, I'm bringing back some of the punch on that kick instrument with a really fast attack expander. Or it could be the other way around. I don't want to take too much low end out of this record, but the kick is just overwhelming the bass in a way that's not working. And I don't want to just cut a whole bunch of 60 hertz. What if I could soften the attack of the kick without taking down the bass overall? Now I might use it as a downward compressor. And I want to do that usually before I hit my EQ chain and before I hit my compressors. So that if I'm making these changes to the low end, especially if I'm making some negative changes to low end, that the low end that I'm subtracting isn't influencing my compressor. So that the compressor isn't being triggered by all this low end that I'm actually taking away in the record. And then since it's there, I'll often do, if I want to do a little bit of high frequency de-essing, I might do that on a record that has overly bright cymbals or overly spiky sounding acoustic guitars. Not uncommon at all. I might want to find a spot in the high frequencies, maybe just in the center, maybe just in the sides. Maybe there's a shaker off to the left, and just in the left, I want to take that down. And I'll often do that before hitting the EQ because I might want to, say, soften the transients on a too spiky shaker or too spiky acoustic guitar or too shrill and bright cymbals, soften the transients on them, smooth them out, but then bring back some high frequency. So my EQ comes after that in the chain. And again, because I'm doing something negative with a dynamic EQ, taking things away that I don't want influencing my compressor, I want them to happen before my compressor. And then I might want to make broad adjustments to the sound after that. So my EQ will usually come after my multiband compressor or my dynamic EQ, which will go on last. And the reason my multiband compressor or dynamic EQ goes on last is because I use them to solve problems. Ideally, I don't even need to open them up. Ideally, I put on my master, my master limiter, and I put on my EQ, and I'm done. And I do very little with each. But sometimes it needs a little bit more, so I add in the compressor. That will come after the EQ in the chain, usually when it comes to mastering. After that, I might need a little bit more. So I might think about, do I need dynamic control or tonal shaping? I might think about a compressor, and I might think then about my saturators. After that, I might want to add some little bit of stereo width to the record. So I'm thinking about putting in my stereo wideners, which come late in the chain. And then after that, I might still be running into problems and say, this is all pretty good, except there's this thing that's happening in the lows, or there's this thing that's happening in the highs. Why don't I put on a dynamic range a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor to just add some additional control to the lows, to the mids, to the highs. And I'll usually end up putting that first in the chain before hitting all the other processors. And that will usually be most beneficial. That said, there's not a rule to this. Every once in a while, I find myself doing a multiband compressor late in the chain, especially if I'm looking to just do something a little demented, like it needs a little bit of extra help, and I'm using it almost as a tonal reshaping device, that I've got everything set, but it just needs that little bit of extra, then maybe I'll put something like the API multiband compressor closer to the end of the chain, because I'm using it a little bit more like a saturation color box device, and I'm using it less as a compressor. And maybe I'm kind of really digging in hard with a multiband compressor, and then just dialing in a few percent of it, using it more like a color box than like a compressor. And that's why I might put a multiband compressor later on. And that's pretty much all the stuff that I might use in mastering. Sometimes it can look like this where there's a ton of stuff, and sometimes it can look really simple where there's literally 2 plugins on the master. That's my order of operations and the order they go in. The order of the frequency, the order of the signal path usually ends up being a multiband processor of some kind into an EQ, into a compressor. Every once in a while, there's another EQ after the compressor. I didn't say that part, but I'm saying it now. Then, after that, going into maybe additional saturators. Then after that, going into a stereo spreader of some kind. And then after that, going into the limiter. So that is a signal path, but that's not the order that I put them in, if that makes sense. And the same thing may happen to you in mixing. I would say this order of operations usually makes a lot of sense for mixing as well, with 2 little exceptions. One, when you're mixing, if you're using de-essers, those often should go at the end of the chain. If you need to do the type of compression that you really need to do on a vocal, sometimes you need to compress a vocal like 10 dB to make it work right in a lot of modern pop styles. Like vocals are heavily compressed in a lot of genres, and a lot of new mixers undercompress their vocals. So you might need cumulative 5, 10, 20 dB of compression on a vocal, and then your transients could be poking out like crazy. If you put your de-esser first when you're doing that crazy amount of compression, it might not de-ess enough for you. Like it might just de-ess a few dB because the transients aren't that much hotter than the rest of the signal, so the de-esser is not going to do a ton. But after you go through a ton of compression, that's allowing the initial sibilant transients through, your new transient now, your sibilants, after a lot of compression, could be 20 dB above the average signal or more. It could be 25 dB above. So you might need a ton of de-essing, more than you think you need. And if you need to go in harder with a de-esser, that might want to happen after the chain, after your compressors. So this is one thing that's different with mixing, particularly vocal mixing. I used to try to do this and put de-essers at the beginning before compressors, thinking, oh, I'll de-ess first and then we'll go into the compressors. No, it does work way better. I've tried it both ways. The advice was given to me once, like do it the other way around. I'm like, no, that sounds stupid. It theoretically doesn't make sense to me. But then I did it. I'm like, oh no, wait, this is better. And now I understand why it makes sense. I'd recommend de-essers come pretty much at the end of the chain, usually when you're vocal processing, and definitely after your heaviest hitting slower attack compressors. So that's one difference for mixing. Another difference here is I'm usually EQing and then going into a compressor because the amounts of EQ I'm doing in mastering are generally subtle. And there's often subtractive things happening in the low frequencies where I don't want to be taking away lows and low mids and then having those lows and low mids influence the compressor. So usually my predominant EQing in mastering comes before the compressor. Sometimes when you are doing mixing and you're doing really heavy amounts of compression on particular instruments, you can get more power out of your EQ by putting it afterwards. Generally speaking, broader EQ and more subtractive EQ makes sense to go before compressors. Because if you're subtracting things, you're taking things out of the signal before you hit your compressor, you don't necessarily want those things you're removing from the signal influencing the compressor. So the more that things are subtractive and the more that they're kind of broadly reshaping, generally those EQs coming before compressors make sense. That said, if you want the EQ to have a lot of power, or if you want to boost elements, boosts often make sense coming after a compressor. Because if you boost heavily into a compressor, what's getting compressed the most? Well, the things you just boosted. And in those cases where you want to do a really big high frequency or upper mid-range boost on a compressor and you're looking to highlight those areas, on an EQ and you're looking to highlight those areas, those are the very things that are going to get compressed most by the compressor. So it's kind of reel in some of the EQing that you're doing. Sometimes that's desired because you want your compressor to counteract your EQ a little bit and reel it in a little bit. But if you want to be really powerful and you want to make smaller adjustments that aren't counteracted by your compressor, then putting an EQ after your compressor can make sense. And every once in a while, I'll be near the end of a master and I'll say, I really like everything, except I just want just a tiny bit more top end lift here, or low end lift there. And I don't want to have that trigger the compressor more. So I'm going to put that little bit of additional thing that I want to add after my compressor. So that may happen for me in mastering as well. What do my chains look like? They could look as simple as 2 plugins, but they often look something like this. Hopefully I'm not using a multiband tool because the mix doesn't need it. If it does need it, that's usually one of the first items in the chain, but I put it on last. After that, we're going to an EQ, which is probably the most powerful and important tool in mastering and in mixing in general. Like after the volume fader is your most powerful tool in mixing. Your second most powerful tool in mixing is EQ, and it's probably your most powerful tool in mastering. So EQ is next, and it's like the second thing that I set. The third thing after that, compression, potentially, and or saturation devices. I'd maybe say saturation after compression if you're thinking about those separately. Compression, then saturation. And I generally do them in that order. And saturation would include things like tape simulators. Then after that, stereo wideners. And then after that, limiters. But the limiter is the first thing I put on, even though it's the last thing in the chain. So I generally put on the last thing in my chain first and the first thing in my chain last. And I hope that makes some sense to you. Now, I've gone way long here. We're 56 minutes, but this has been a masterclass that I should probably totally charge for. But if I was going to charge for it, I'd make it into one of my courses where I would script this thing in advance, edit it, I'd put it chock full with audio examples, and it would turn into like one of my 8 or 9 hour courses that are probably one of the most useful, valuable things I've ever done in my life. And one of the biggest things you can do to change the way that you work forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. If you want this explained better, with more advanced scripting and editing and even more tight and seamless with a ton of audio examples, the best thing you can do is check out one of the great full-length courses. For you in particular, if you're interested in mastering, check out Mastering Demystified. It will teach you everything you need to know about mastering. It'll take you from knowing nothing about mastering to knowing literally everything you need to know to master for yourself and for others. Now, knowledge is one part. You've also got to get the practice in. So we have a whole bunch of practice mastering sessions. You can open up, see exactly what I did to these mastering sessions, play around with it yourself, and you can master these tracks for yourself with the guidelines that I've given you. Also, you get to put to bed whether or not it really matters to be mastering on an analog system. And one of the masters in that record, in that course, one of the masters I do in that course, I master on the really nice analog system that I trained on and used for years at Joel Lambert Mastering. And then I remastered again using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools. And I think you will be amazed at how close I can get those two things to sound without even using any of these fancy plugins I like to use. I like to use the plugin align stuff, the universal audio stuff. There's some wave stuff that I like. There's stuff from a whole bunch of brands that I really like. The Fab Filter stuff. There are so many brands whose stuff I like. But even if you restrict me just to stock plugins in Pro Tools, and I wasn't even able to use saturators, I think, in that one, I can get so close. Because it really is about the principles, how you use these tools, and you can hear A to B comparisons of stock plugins in Pro Tools versus fancy, high-end, super expensive mastering rig. And I think it'll be instructive for you to hear those before and afters and hear how close you can get. And also, for those of you who are discerning, how close you can't get and what some of those differences are. And I really think it'll be an amazing ear training exercise for you, along with all the other mastering that I do in the course. I think there's 5 different masters and 5 different genres, and you can master along, see my exact settings, all that good stuff. So check out Mastering Demystified at masteringdemystified.com. Check out Mixing Breakthroughs at mixingbreakthroughs.com. And thanks for hanging out with me. Big shout out and thanks again to Sound Toys, sponsoring as always, making some of my favorite stuff out there. See you next time. It's been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Happy New Year and have a good one.